Next, we have to think about the arguments that are connected to the thesis and how they are going to support your thesis. So each paragraph, think of each paragraph as having a clear idea or argument that it's asserting. So each paragraph should almost be its own little entity and should be able to stand on its own as an idea and as an argument. And it should be very clear from the first sentence how it's linked to the thesis. Okay, so right off the bat, when I'm reading that first sentence, it has to be clear why I'm reading that sentence. Why am I reading the sentence? What has this got to do with, what's it got to do with what you just talked about in terms of your thesis? Okay. Now, these arguments, what are these arguments and what are they not? So the arguments are not plot summaries. This is the number, when it comes to arguments, this is, remember I talked about a lot of the traps for theses that I've seen. When it comes to arguments, the biggest by far, 99% of the traps I see when it comes to people making arguments is they mistake plot summary for an argument. Okay, so plot summary is not an argument. So here's an example of someone writing about Plato's cave, thinking they're making an argument, but they're just summarizing the cave. So when one of the prisoners is freed and let out of the cave for the first time, he must adjust to the brighter light outside the cave. Once this adjustment takes place, he is able to see the world as it really is. He then returns to the cave to bring this new knowledge back, etc., etc. Okay? So the arguments need to be points that, or ideas that one is making that support an argumentative or controversial thesis that someone is making. So if I'm saying that, let's say Henry V is a great military leader, is a great leader, period, let's say, for Shakespeare, and I'm going to do it by looking at one particular episode, and I'm going to look at leadership in this way. So I need to confront different other arguments. So he seems in some times to be really cruel. Okay, well, sometimes people see it's cruel. However, this is also the way he does it, it's also a sign of great leadership because he does this, 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 and this. That's idea one, right? And then, or argument one. And then argument two is how he shows mercy with those at Harfleur or whatever, and you show the evidence to support that. So that's the next point I want to get to is the arguments need evidence to back them up. Okay, so when it comes to evidence, the biggest thing I see is people don't have evidence. They do not show evidence. Okay. Now I try to think of what you're doing here as you're a defense attorney. So I love this analogy. Okay. So the thesis in your case, so your thesis is kind of like the defense attorney saying, my client is innocent. Okay. Now your argument, maybe your first argument is she could not have committed the murder because she was out of town that day. So a good defense attorney is going to have several arguments that they make. They're going to have character witnesses. They're going to have, she couldn't have done it because she's an upstanding person of the community. And my evidence, I've got these character witnesses to back me up. Argument two, she didn't even have opportunity to commit the murder because she was out of town that day. Evidence, I've got eyewitness accounts of her presence elsewhere. I've got travel receipts. I've got GPS cell phone data. Okay, so if I'm a good defense attorney, I've got a very clear thesis. Defense attorneys really thesis is really clear. My client's innocent. You can't get a clearer thesis, right? And then you've got a very clear argument that's logically connected to it. Okay, why do I think that my client's innocent? Because they weren't even there. And then they've got evidence. So in our case, it's going to be citations from the primary text. It's going to be citations from secondary texts that, let's say, corroborate with you, or that you're let's say, dismissing their arguments very plainly. So logical organizations and connections. So within the paragraphs, it's important to ensure that it's clear to the reader how the idea or argument of the paragraph connects to the thesis, and how the evidence connects or reinforces that argument. So that's all part of the logical connections, right? So in my example of my client was innocent, the connections are really clear because it's something we understand. It's something we heard in courtroom dramas a million times, but we don't often hear arguments around a play. So we have to make sure when you read it, it's very clear that an uninformed jury, let's say, or a jury of your peers that knows, as I said, is they're not uninformed, they're university educated and they know Shakespeare, but they don't know what path you've gone down, that they will clearly understand the point you're making with respect to how that evidence supports your argument, how that argument supports your thesis. And make sure that there's logical connections between the paragraphs. And for both of those, I think that the best trick I would point you to is really trying to think about, do I need to use any of these joining words, let's call them here, that help to clarify logical connections? So conjunctive adverbs such as however, moreover, therefore, and coordinating conjunctions, and, but, or, not. So these, the function of these types of words are to show a logical relationship to that which has gone before, right? Is to guide the reader for how your next sentence will either depart, however, even though this is the case, even though the evidence seems to say this, however, I think this is happening. So the actual, in that case, the conjunctive adverb almost puts a little connecting thread visually there between the two clauses. Okay, so those are the first three elements that we're talking about in our grading rubric.